Excellent. So welcome everybody. Morning for me here in Colorado, but the wonderful technology allows us to get together no matter where we are in the world. So good morning, good afternoon, perhaps good evening. Thank you so much for joining us today. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining us for this seminar today on gender and whistleblowing, a hidden aspect of speaking up. So Professor Kate Kenny and I are delighted to welcome you and our 5 wonderful speakers today. This topic is something that I've been interested in for a little while. But it was just astounding to me that we've gotten this far down the road in whistleblowing research, and this conversation is starting, but it's a topic that obviously has generated a lot of interest and has brought a lot of people together today. So obviously the topic is about gender and whistleblowing. We've got a range of speakers that are going to share their perspectives and their experience and their expertise with you this morning. My own background is in whistleblowing, and I was interested in this topic because of an article that I read by a couple of our speakers today. But it's really interesting to think about, okay, when we talk about whistleblowing, when we talk about people speaking up, we often talk about it from a gender neutral standpoint. We talk about the whistleblower. And so does this overlook some aspects of the experience of somebody speaking up? Does it overlook some aspects of protections that are needed for people that speak up from a different standpoint? So I wanted to thank the Whitaker Institute for hosting this event today. We've definitely benefited from their support and expertise. So thank you very much for that. Also wanted to note that this event is sponsored by the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Project Fund in UI Galway. So thank them very much for that. So with that said, we will go ahead and just present our first speaker, who is Bridget McCarthy. So Bridget McCarthy is an organizational consultant working in health and social care services and coaching individuals from a range of corporate and public service settings. She's originally trained as a clinical psychologist, and she's managed and researched mental health services within the NHS. She continues to work psychotherapeutically with complex mental health needs. And she's currently undertaking the professional doctorate in consultation at the Tavistock Centre in London. Her thesis topic is a study of systemic and psychodynamic issues which shape workers' reaction to wrongdoing within organizations. And I'm very pleased to present Bridget. So Bridget, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to talk really about female whistleblowers as they're represented in film. And I have to apologise that I'm simply going to read it, because with 8 minutes, I really felt that it was going to be difficult to pack in what I wanted to say unless I read it. Many apologies. So let me just move this on. So I've long been preoccupied with the question of how an individual comes to be able to think and act independently of the social norms of their organisation. It was this issue, in fact, which sparked my interest in whistleblowing in the first place, not just the social norms of their organisation, but of their world in general. And generally, popular cinema's compelling narratives offer audiences a way to make sense of their world. Film narratives both reflect shared cultural assumptions and induct the audience into systems of rules and values. In film, routinely, Mulvey, a particular theorist of film, said, "The glamorous impersonates the ordinary." Through a process of recognizing similarity and difference, audiences are enticed to identify with characters and then internalize new ego ideals. All forms of narrative, film included, provide a model of how life can be lived, a model of and for meaning and value in social life. So popular cinema, maybe I should explain that I've put up some slides just to kind of talk you through the theoretical thinking, because I'm not going to go into it in any detail. So you might be a bit puzzled why the slide shows this, while I'm talking exclusively about popular cinema for the time being. So it's been fascinated by the figure of the whistleblower. And they have various kind of characterizations, not many of them positive. And there are numerous lists of X number of best ever whistleblowing films, beginning in 1939 with the seminal Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, which, if you haven't seen it already, is really worth a watch for its parallels to the current turbulence in US politics. So these films provide an invaluable archive of constructions of the act of whistleblowing, shifting across social and political contexts. Consumers are informed about the moral value of whistleblowing and the fate of whistleblowers, and sometimes what happens to bystanders too. So I made a close textual analysis of 3 films initially, All As It Happened, featuring men chosen by the way that they span 7 decades to extract dominant and marginalized or impossible discursive positions projected by those films. And I've referenced the paper in the list of sources which I've attached to the end of this PowerPoint, and you can find details of the method and findings there. So comparing the 3 male films, I think you'll probably struggle to see that, but again, hopefully if you want to access it, it's both in the paper and you can ask for the PowerPoint. So broadly, with the men's films, I found that the film's narrative shared a structure that reminded me very much of classical Westerns. There's a confrontation between society versus lawlessness. A heroic but somehow alienated individual challenges a contemporary evil in order to expose wrongdoing and bring about change. The heroic whistleblowers, which exemplify Foucault's process of paresia, their credibility as truth tellers is established at the beginning of the film. They struggle courageously towards finding a voice at some risk to themselves in order to speak truth to power. But it never seems to end well for the whistleblower. The audience is simultaneously titillated to identify with the hero and warned off from following their example. The hero is destroyed either literally or socially, and the corrupt system survives more or less unchanged. So films which feature whistleblowers are no different in those aspects, but they have the added problem, which has been identified repeatedly by theorists of film, of film as social practice, that films which feature a woman as the main character are somehow less available as fantasy. Increasingly, we're offered images of powerful and self-determining women in film and TV. But Mulvey again comments that still these images are inclined to define women as not men, and that successful alternatives to a doomed identification with a phallic and narcissistic version of masculinity are hard to find. And that did really check out with my survey of whistleblowing films featuring women. So I looked at in detail at 3 films featuring whistleblowing women, and they all happen to be dramatizations of true stories. In addition, there's The Constant Gardener, which is an example of a purely fictional representation that follows a very similar structure. In Silkwood, the eponymous heroine works at a plutonium processing plant in the US, is purposefully contaminated, psychologically tortured and possibly murdered to prevent her from exposing worker safety violations at the plant. Unlike the other 2 films I've dealt with, this was a box office success. It fits into a genre of political thriller and works considerable suspense into the narrative. And I think it's a relatively early, in being 1983, relatively early representation of an independent woman challenging the system. But Karen Silkwood is presented as a morally ambiguous and vulnerable figure. She becomes contaminated by radiation, but metaphorically, there's a suggestion that this internal contamination may also be political activism for which she is duly punished. Moving on, The Whistleblower from 2010 is based on the experiences of Catherine Bolkovac, a Nebraska cop who served as a peacekeeper in post-war Bosnia and outed the UN for covering up a sex trafficking scandal. This is very much a woman's film. It has a female hero, exclusively female victims, and the key powerful figure from the UNHCR is also female. The film's almost a Scandi noir. The suspense is intense, enhanced by documentary-style handheld cameras and the deep gloom and bleak settings of the crime scenes outside the UN premises. The horror of the crimes perpetrated, the collusion of peacekeeping personnel and complacency of the system slowly are revealed. Critics pan the film for a literal-minded approach to the material and violence they considered exploitative, but the makers themselves and Catherine herself said, actually, the violence was toned down in order to win an audience, not to alienate an audience. But I was very struck that Catherine enters a masculine world. It's a hard drinking world. She's quite flirtatious. At one moment, she plays a pinball machine, which has naked girls on its base. She has to be tough to negotiate this world. And there's a sidebar of a quickly developing liaison with a married man. She's an impressive individual, but she's represented, unlike the other two films, as masculinized, perhaps to empower her in a hypermasculine and phallic world. She's always in androgynous uniform trousers. She tries to push men around, literally physically at one point. And she's challenged with being married to her job, and the human resources man at a key point questions, is she not the maternal type? So moving on to Official Secrets, 2019, which I guess many of you will have seen. It's the story of a British whistleblower who leaked information to the press about an illegal NSA spy operation designed to push the Security Council into sanctioning the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Catherine's ordinariness, hesitancy, and vulnerability is emphasized from the start. Filmmakers strove for accuracy about dramatic tension. They said that's what they were aiming for. The critics attacked the film for being spatchcocked by earnestness and commented that it's hard to make a drama out of a girl photocopying an email. It's emphatically not a James Bond movie. And in fact, the journalists get the best bits. Their world is funny, exciting, they're cynical but lovable rogues. So putting these three films together, in all three films, the whistleblower is an ordinary person doing extraordinary things, which is not a theme that's marked in the male films. All three women are represented as, at least to some extent, marginalized, having either outright failed in traditional roles as wives and mothers, which is Silkwood and the whistleblower, or as being married to someone who is themselves marginalized. Catherine Gunn is advised by her lawyers that her husband is best kept out of the public gaze as an asylum seeker. Unlike their male counterparts, these aberrations of traditional roles are plot levers and offered as an important trigger to account for their whistleblowing activities as they're increasingly marginalized. They emerge into ethico-political subjects only after they've shaken off the pull towards settled domesticity. And they're routinely guided, facilitated, or rescued by men who enable their whistleblowing. Perhaps the most emphatic image of this process is in Official Secrets, where the final scene in the film has the male lawyer occupying the position of right triumphing over might as he faces down the DPP in their domestic private world. They all meet a sticky end, either physically, Silkwood and the Constant Gardener, or through social annihilation, the whistleblower and Official Secrets. They're powerless to create effective change. Silkwood was destroyed, killed, and her evidence with her. UN staff went unpunished because in the whistleblower, because the UN can't be called to account, and the trafficking and sexual exploitation of women has doubled from the 2 million quoted at the end of the film to 4.8 million in 2020. Catherine Gunn didn't stop the Iraq War, and indeed Snowden's leaks show how NSA was still operating outside the law in 2013. So I am sorry to present such a bleak picture, but this seems to be what we're being interpolated into thinking about female whistleblowers in that way. That's it.
Thank you so much, Bridget, and just to say hi to all the participants who've joined us since the start. I just found that incredible start to our session today. These films that many of us are familiar with, and you've kind of put up some, I suppose, implicit challenges to ourselves who research whistleblowing, that first to challenge one of the most emergingly popular theories of Foucault's parrhesia. And as you begin by saying that the implicit figure at the heart, for those of you who aren't familiar with these debates, the idea of parrhesia from ancient Greece, this speaker of truth to power, this challenger of the institution, is a concept that Michel Foucault has been using, and then a lot of whistleblowing scholars are sort of drawing on. And as you say, the figure at the heart of this is often implicitly genderless, or in many cases masculine. And so the analysis that you provide opens up our discussion of how that might be other. And if it's not, and if the female figure is at stake, as in these films, what does that mean for the representation of this person, this figure? And so I got so much from this. Thank you so much, Bridget. So we're moving on now to our next speaker, Laura. So we're delighted Dr. Laura William joins us today. Dr. William holds a PhD from Cardiff University, and she's now an associate professor at the University of Greenwich, where she founded and leads the Diversity Interest Group. That's a pan-university research group focusing on equality and diversity. And Laura is also a co-director of the Centre for Research in Employment and Work. Her research focuses on equality and diversity and employee relations. Laura is particularly interested in how legislation is operationalized in employment tribunals in the workplace, a vital topic. Laura is an executive board member also for the British Universities Industrial Relations Association, having developed its code of practice and contributing to the running of Bureau. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about gender and whistleblowing claims using employment tribunal judgments. This work was carried out by myself and Professor Wim van der Kerkhove from the Centre for Research and Employment at Work at the University of Greenwich, and it was funded by the Leverhulme and British Academy. Oh, yeah, slides didn't want to move over then. Okay. So this project investigated whistleblowing detriment, but I'm just going to refer to whistleblowing throughout the presentation for ease. To do this, we carried out an analysis of the employment tribunal judgments that went to preliminary hearing in England and Wales between 2015 and 2018 inclusive. The full sample that we analysed was 603 judgments in total. We collected these judgments for 2015 and 2016 from Bury St Edmunds, which is a central archive in England, and then the Ministry of Justice uploaded judgments for 2017 onwards, so we got them from their electronic database. We based our coding on initially the Survey of Employment Tribunal Applications SETA, but then we expanded it to include additional variables of interest, such as was the whistleblower subject to detriment as legally defined. We examined various issues in this research project, but for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to be presenting what we found in terms of gender. So what context does this research sit in? Well, this research sits in a context where existing research finds little relationship between gender and employment tribunals generally. The most recent SETA survey, released in 2020, shows that across the board, women bring fewer claims than men to employment tribunal, but importantly, gender doesn't appear to be linked to success at employment tribunal when you look at claims across the board. And also, this is a finding that I had when I carried out this study focusing just on disability discrimination judgments. So there's not much gender difference we're seeing at employment tribunal other than that women bring fewer claims than men, but this isn't translated into differences in terms of success. So we wanted to determine, was this the case for whistleblowing? Because the SETA survey doesn't drill down the data very much at all. So what did we find? We found using the 2015 to 2018 sample, 57.7% of claims were made by men and 42.3% were made by women. So if we compare this to the gender distribution in the workforce overall using data provided by the Office of National Statistics, they say that 46.9% of the workforce are women So therefore, we conclude that women are not overrepresented at employment tribunal, and this fits with wider research on disability and claims in general. And we propose this is because men are more aware of their rights and therefore more likely to bring a claim than women, as reported by MEGA in 2002. So if that's bringing a case, what about the outcome of the case for whistleblowing? So we categorise the outcome of a case into 5 categories: dismissed after preliminary, withdrawn after preliminary, it's a bit of a tongue twister, preliminary, successful, unsuccessful at full hearing, or the claim was settled. And we see similar levels of women losing their claim at full hearing as men, and similar levels being successful. But we do see more women settling than men and withdrawing their case after preliminary hearing. So these gender effects are very small, but there are particularly strong gender effects when you talk about automatic unfair dismissal for whistleblowing. Employment tribunal judges rule that nearly 25% of female whistleblowers say that their whistleblowing claim was legitimate, but their unfair dismissal was not automatically unfair. And this is compared to only 7.9% of men. So you can see quite a strong gender effect there when you come to automatic unfair dismissal. So while these effects are quite small, apart from the automatic unfair dismissal, we think that hides a lot of what's going on behind the scenes. And the title of my presentation here is Stressed Out and Alone. And that's because we see that women showing much higher levels of sick leave in relation to their whistleblowing claim before the case gets to employment tribunal than men are. And women are more likely to take sick leave than men, and this suggests a much more stressful experience of the whistleblowing process for women. So the stress gets worse. So we looked at representation and gender. So we looked at all the different variables that affect the outcome of the claim, and we found the most significant is representation, and closely linked to that is equality of arms. Now, equality of arms is the balance of power between the representative of the claimant, if they have one, and the representative of the employer. So looking at these graphs, we can see that across the board, whistleblowing cases that are successful at employment tribunal for both men and women are more successful if they have legal representation compared to if they represent themselves. But this effect of legal representation is greater for male whistleblowers than for women. And it suggests that legal representation has a larger premium for male whistleblowers than female whistleblowers. But you can also see that self-representation has a more negative effect on men than it does on women. So looking now at equality of arms and gender, which is closely linked to representation, we wanted to see if gender affected equality of arms. So to assess equality of arms, each case was coded for type of representation, from the least powerful, which is no representation and not turning up at the hearing, to the most powerful representation, which is legal representation. We aggregated these categories into 5 matched categories for employer and claimant, and each category was given a value from 0 to 4. We then subtracted claimant representation from employer representation to give this equality of arms score. So this graph shows us that the impact of gender is quite stark. Female whistleblowers tend to have less expert representation than the employer. And when we ran some multinomial logistic regression analysis for 2 dependent variables, the outcome of the whistleblowing claim and equality of arms, we didn't find a significant effect of gender on equality of arms. But we do see that women are more likely to be litigants in person. And if you don't have that representation, you are going to have a more stressful experience. So next, we wanted to investigate the combination of claims brought in a case. So we find that whistleblowing claims brought in combination with discrimination claims are least likely to be successful. So women are more likely to bring a discrimination claim than men in combination with their whistleblowing claim, and they are more likely to have this claim as judged as successful. So why is this important? It's important because it shows women are experiencing more discrimination in combination with and part of their whistleblowing detriment than men, also suggesting that women are having a more stressful experience. So what's our conclusion? Well, the main take-home message from our research is that women have a distinct experience of the employment tribunal process compared to men. While on the surface, things appear relatively equal in terms of outcomes, we find that women aren't overrepresented, and we find that women are slightly more successful than men when they self-represent. But women are less successful than men at quite high levels when automatic unfair dismissal is claimed. So we believe these findings are hiding a distinct experience for women. Before they get to employment tribunal, they're more likely to be stressed, shown in the higher levels of sick leave for women. They're more likely to be stressed inside the tribunal because they are more likely to self-represent. And even if the employment tribunal upholds a protected disclosure was made, it's unlikely the automatic dismissal claim as part of a detriment is going to be upheld for women, causing further stress for them. And women are more likely to experience discrimination, which makes the process of detriment for them more stressful in the workplace, but also reduces chances of success for claims made at the employment tribunal. We need more research on this topic. We need to look at this topic from a qualitative perspective, and we need to think about what we should be measuring, and we need to particularly look at compensation levels, and are there differences in compensation levels between men and women. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Laura. This is this hard data, as you will, is just so interesting and points to interesting stories. So, you know, if we know that women are having a different experience in employment tribunals, and we know that they're probably having a different experience before tribunals, as you've mentioned, by your sick leave, perhaps this experience of speaking up is different for women, and perhaps the protections that are needed for them from a legal standpoint or from a policy standpoint might be different. I find it, you know, just the numbers of 25% of women don't have the automatic unfair dismissal as compared to 7.9% of men. That's quite a stark difference. And it is interesting, and as you said, we do need more research in this area to sort of understand the why behind these numbers. But it's so great to have, you know, a quantitative examination of this area, and it just really points to some of the issues that I really hope get explored coming forward. But we will move to our next speaker, who is Mao Fantini, who is an assistant professor in organization studies at the Institut, my French is horrendous, I'm sorry, Institut de Recherche en Gestion from Paris. So her current research focuses on the gender dimensions of whistleblowing and the conditions for critique in organizations. I have the pleasure of having Mao as one of my co-authors. So I know that she's got lots of interesting things to say, and I look forward to her presentation. So Mao, over to you.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for offering me to join this conversation today. So I would like to take the opportunity to make a few points about whistleblowing in organization studies and reflect on the literature to date, because it's been now 40 years since scholars have started to be interested in the topic. And so I would like to argue, in my opinion, there are three moments in this history of literature. At the beginning, scholars were very interested in individual subject dimensions of the whistleblower as an individual. So what would motivate the whistleblower, what were their backgrounds, their journeys, and this interest was in the perspective of predicting which employee was, or at least identifying which employee were more likely to blow the whistle. And I think, in my opinion, there was an underlying assumption of suspicion towards employees that were likely to blow the whistle. And for at the beginning of 2000 something, scholars have been changing the focus, not of all of them, but some of them have been interested in using a Foucauldian lens to explore whistleblowing through the concept of paresia that Kate mentioned earlier. So the concept of Michel Foucault and ancient Greek as well, to how people were able to speak truth to power, the use of courage, and the way we could organize courage, as some of our colleagues have investigated. But I think that for all of this work, the underlying assumption was that the whistleblower is a male subject, and even if it's not the case, there was this underlying assumption. And I think one of the reasons is because Michel Foucault probably overlooked the question of gender in its work, or not only in his work on sexuality, but also on other works as well, so, which has probably framed the whistleblowing studies to date. So now we are talking of and questioning a gender turn in whistleblowing studies, which is very exciting, of course, because it opens up to a new path of research on subjectivities, the construction of subjectivities, norms, language, and lots of topics that gender studies have been exploring. So with Kate, we are currently working on a research project that analyzes accounts of whistleblowing from a qualitative perspective. And we do study the cases of women who have blown the whistle in the financial or service industry in France, in the United States, and in Ireland as well. And so this is I wanted to share with you some of the early findings we have been discussing in the context of this project, which is not, we are still working on, because these are very, very interesting trends that we see in the way these women talk and narrate their experiences as whistleblowers. So one of the trend that was striking in observing and in analyzing these accounts of whistleblowing in the financial industry was the way these women would position themselves as regards with others, colleagues or former managers, or even the organization. They position themselves at the center of a social network. And so a kind of relationality. So we've been working on this concept of affective relationality, because we also see that these women seem very attached to their structure. They had this idea that they would cure, or they definitely cared about the organization, and they would cure the organization. So they have been voicing concern about embezzlement or fraud of various kinds. And they seem to care for the persons, even though they have hurt them. And we have lots of verbatims, such as I did this for my kids, I'm a mother of my kids. They seem to care, still care, or be affectively attached to colleagues, and so on. A second trend that we noticed, which is also very exciting, not only for the empirical insights, but also for the theoretical contribution, is the use of humor. Like they have all of them have the sense of humor, and they kind of make fun of their situations and the way they recall it. And of course, it's not only interesting, but it's also testify of their ability to make sense of their situation. And it also shows the way how they position themselves as outsiders, and how they have managed to come a long way to be able to reflect on their experience. So sense of humor, and also a very clever and acute ability to analyze the situation, analyze the positions of power, and how how the situations of whistleblowing unfold. And so in the end, as we could have expected, and there are also lots of stress or anxiety, but there is also some joy. And this emotion is significant in my opinion, because some feminist authors have underlined the importance of joy for people in situation of domination to be able to make sense of their experience. So I'm thinking of Angela Davis here, who has written about the joy of being a Black woman and other works. So we want also to investigate this question of joy in these accounts. So the last, so there are many findings I could talk about, but we also noticed a lesser desire to return to the organization, which is striking because other accounts show how whistleblowers try to can mend their experience by going back to the organization and enforcing their organizational identity by going back to their corporate environment, which is not that much the case in the accounts we've been investigated. So I think I'm running out of time, but I will jump to my conclusion. So what is very interesting is that most of the women we have interviewed have been navigated a male-defined corporate environments, which is the case in most financial environments today, but none of them consider a feminist background to make sense of their cases. So it also, so I'm aware that I'm opening questions here and issues and not giving answers, but it's, yeah, I wanted to share this with you. And so one of our conclusion is that women whistleblowers are certainly at the intersection of several forms of oppressions. So there are a few lenses we could investigate. For example, and it makes me think of what Laura has just said. We could question the fact that how the hierarchy status or the position of power with in the corporate environment is able to protect these women in the retaliation process that most whistleblowers experience. And it seems that it does not protect women. So there are some issues that we could investigate at the crossroads between whistleblowing studies and gender studies that are concerned with women at work and working women. Yeah, and I will end by saying that investigating from a qualitative perspective the experience of women whistleblowers is especially important. And in terms of knowledge, it sheds a new light, an innovative light in what we know from what whistleblowing studies have been looking at for the past years. And like their subject position within the organization, their marginal subjects position is likely to produce different knowledge that is very especially valuable for us. And I will end here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Matt, for the presentation, and I think really chimes in well with what Laura and Bridget were speaking about, the emphasis that was being found on sort of care relationships and relations to the other and attachments, detracts from this traditional heroic conquer story that, you know, Bridget was describing in terms of male depictions in film. And as you note, the qualitative view can open up, hopefully, as work continues, that perspective, open up some of the questions that Laura's study is raising around what is going on in these experiences that seem quite different in some respects, and then the question of in what ways. We're getting some questions coming in. That's great. Feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A as we go, and we'll get back very at the end to as many as we can. So moving on now to our next presenters, because there's two people involved, and I'm going to present Dr. Nana Bond-Thilstrup, who's an associate professor of communication and digital media at Copenhagen Business School. So her current writing and teaching focuses on the ethical politics of digital media, digital sustainability, and digital epistemologies. And more specifically, she's interested in how media theory, cultural theory, and critical theory can unpack and unfold issues related to datafication and digitalization, in particular those related to gender, race, and colonialism. Her most recent book is Uncertain Archives, Critical Keywords for the Age of Big Data, published by MIT Press in 2021. Congratulations. Co-edited with Daniela Agostino, Catherine D'Ignazio, Annie Ring, and Kristen Veal. And Daniela Agostino is a feminist cultural theorist affiliated with the University of Copenhagen. Her research is situated within critical studies of digital culture and emerging technologies, in particular feminist and decolonial perspectives on visual culture and datafication. She is co-editor of the book just mentioned, along with War and Archives together, the title Archival Imaginaries, War and Contemporary Art, published by Sternberg Press in 2020, and The Uncertain Image, published by Routledge 2019. So welcome both.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Sorry about that. So thank you so much for this generous introduction. Thank you for the invitation to this seminar on the relevance of gender in whistleblowing research and theories. So in short, our presentation, in this short presentation, we would like to raise a few points that we elaborate on in our article, If Truth Was a Woman, Leaky Infrastructures and the Gender Politics of Truth-Telling, published in Ephemera in a special issue on the ethical politics of whistleblowing, mediated truth-telling in digital cultures. In the article, we focus on truth-telling in the wake of the so-called Snowden revelations, and we discuss how gender, sexuality, and race overdetermine what counts as truth and who counts as a truth-teller in the context of digitally mediated information. So we draw on feminist theories and feminist media studies to help us understand how some truth-tellers become widely acknowledged and respected, while others are ignored, discredited, and dismissed. We show how this valuing and devaluing of truth-telling manifests itself in the way some truth-tellers are publicly recognized as whistleblowers, which carries weight and respectability, while discredited figures are described as leakers or as merely having leaked secret information that should not be public knowledge. So we argue that these distinctions are entangled in gendered matrices of control that make possible some truth-telling subjects while foreclosing others. This gendered matrix of control determines that practices of whistleblowing that do not adhere to white heteropatriarchal norms and the subjects who speak outside those norms are devalued, contested, and given lower credibility status. So we see this both in individual examples such as Anita Hill, reality winner, Chelsea Manning, and Christine Blasey Ford, but also in broader social movements such as Me Too and Black Lives Matter.
And so feminist media theorist Zoe Soufoulis helps us understand how these gendered matrices of control are exacerbated by the social technical imaginaries, and in particular, the network technologies that mediate truth-telling practices today. And we draw on Soufoulis' work to argue that technologies themselves are also gendered, which partly explains these normative distinctions between whistleblowing, leaking, and also hacking, where whistleblowing and hacking are socially constructed and perceived as active gestures associated with male subjects and their perceived control and mastery of technology, while leaking is viewed as a passive failure of containment associated with women and non-binary subjects who fail to adhere to the normative truth-telling subject position. And in the slide here, we echo feminist theorist Elizabeth Gross and her reflections on leakiness as a form of corporeality historically associated with women's bodies. And so in this way, leaking, even today, is a term used to discredit truth tellers, who are then described as passive subjects who fail to properly contain truths, while whistleblowing is an active gesture of truth telling associated with expertise and moral conduct. And in the article, we make the point that both women's bodies and technologies are constituted as leaky, and this contributes to the devaluing of whistleblowing when women speak out or speak up.
We see these gender structures echoed in contemporary debates where agency emerges as a key concern. This tweet by Meredith Whittaker, for instance, offers one good example where she rectifies Facebook's discourse on leaking to whistleblowing in a comment on a story about Facebook's reaction to internal leaks. Interestingly, Facebook themselves invoke the World War II slogan, "Loose lips sink ships," which itself mobilized gendered matrices of control to illustrate the dangers of leaking. So I've included here one still from the film. At the same time, Facebook's own reaction is also interesting, since their entire business model is built on leakiness. We draw here on Wendy Chun and Sarah Friedland, who have argued that information leaking is the default nature of digital networks, and that it has also become in recent years a profitable business model in social media platforms and political campaigns such as those that Cambridge Analytica stood behind. As such, these leaky platforms fundamentally counter the public conception of what an information container should be. No longer a sealed off container that holds information and perhaps occasionally fails and leaks, these platforms operate through an infrastructure of information that must constantly leak in order to function properly. Despite this leaking, as the story Meredith Whittaker remarks on shows, however, they're still perceived as a failure and not a norm, and leaky platforms continue to reiterate gendered and sexualized behavior, reinforcing structural vulnerabilities already in place, equating leaky platforms with leaky bodies. The most recent case could be the scandalous firing of Google AI's ethics team leader, Margaret Mitchell, and Timnit Gebru, which offers a case in point. But Gebru's and Mitchell's mobilization of digital networks also helps us understand the power of leaks and how they, as Sarah Ahmed notes, can become not only a leak, but also a feminist lead. They refuse to remain silent and have been successful in mobilizing leaky networks and empower others to speak up about their experiences in the tech industry too, especially in relation to diversity and inclusion. The moment they have created also attests, however, to a marginalized and silenced majority that emerges as a symptom of deeper structural abuse within the tech world.
And so what are the wider implications of these arguments for truth-telling and organizations? And firstly, recognizing such gendered matrices is not only a matter of theoretical importance, we argue, but also a practical question of safety and justice for women, non-binary and racialized truth-tellers. The discrediting of marginalized truth tellers and their consequent invisibilization make them much more vulnerable to legal injustice. And for instance, in the article, we mentioned the example of Reality Winner, who was given away by the journalist from Intercept that she went to with information. And now she's in a vulnerable situation without her due rights in prison and without the media coverage of someone like Snowden or Assange. Secondly, the intersection of truth-telling and network technologies also raises new challenges that not only devalue marginalized truth-telling subjects, but also expose them to new risks such as doxing, online hate speech, among others that come with digitally mediated exposure. And finally, We argue that understanding networked media as fundamentally leaky infrastructures also holds important implications for how we conceptualize the organization of information, and consequently for how we legislate information disclosure and protect truth tellers. If networked communication is essentially leaky, how do we effectively push for an ethics of communication that does not entrench obsolete ideas about privacy and data security, which nowadays are still prevalent in legislation, but rather mobilizes leaks as feminist leads, as Sarah Ahmed says, to effectively protect those most vulnerable to the leakiness of networks? So these are some of the questions that we offer up for discussion. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Daniela and Nana. I'm so delighted that you could come and present today, because it was just such an awakening for me when I read your article in Ephemera, that it was like you'd been asleep or I'd been asleep, and then I read this and I was like, oh my gosh. So it was just really eye-opening for me, and such a wonderful articulation of some really complex topics and ideas about who counts as a truth teller, what counts as truth, and how do we protect people in this sort of environment where technology it has to leak, and networks are leaky. So how do we reframe how we think about protecting people, and how we hear people, and how we would designate them as truth tellers when systems are sort of set up in a way that it is more complex and sort of nuanced than perhaps what the existing legislation and the existing protections perhaps realize. So thank you very much both for your talk. So I know that some of our speakers have to go on the hour, but we have a few minutes for Q&A, and I see there's lots and lots of questions in here. So we will try our best to get to all of them. So I think if we just kind of start at the beginning, there's been a couple of questions about parrhesia and Foucault. So just thinking about if Foucault was thinking about men when he was talking about parrhesia. And there's one other one that's sort of similar to that. So can I just present that to the board? So do we think when Foucault was talking about parrhesia, was he talking about men? I think Mao and Bridget, one of you, do you have a thought on that?
I guess that the idea of women as not men somehow comes in here. That and yes, as far as I know, he never addressed the idea of women having a search for themselves. So they might have done as in this sort of empty way. I think that's the only thought I can produce about it. Mad?
So I am not an expert on Foucault, despite my French background, but I think that when Foucault would develop the rebound on this ancient Greek concept of parrhesia, and when you would work on sexuality in Western societies, he would argue that sexuality in Western societies were very much influenced by Christianity and the Christian religion. So to answer the question, he was, I'm not sure he was especially aiming at talking about male or men when developing the concept of parrhesia, but probably his work was still influenced by religion that have been looking at sexuality from a masculine perspective or patriarchal perspective. This is what I can share with you, a book review. I will share it here. in organization studies on a rereading of Aveux de la chair, so the history of sexuality from a gender perspective. And the writer, she shows that he was very much talking of a male subject when talking about relationships and sexuality. If that answers the question in some ways.
Yep, thanks very much. We've got some questions, Laura, for you on your presentation. Also, I'll just collate two. Can Laura speak to the effect of the payment of court fees for tribunals 2013 to 2017 and how this may have skewed claims is one. And there's some more detailed queries on the project, but I can send these to you yourself. Another question, second question, are there any analyses focusing on the potential influence of the judge's gender on the decision? So judge's gender and the court fees query.
Okay, thank you. So the tribunal fees introduced in 2013 were introduced to try and shift a proportion of the cost of the employment tribunal system onto those who used it, but also to reduce vexatious claims. So what we see is that there's been a reduction in claims overall. So this suggests that it didn't just discourage vexatious claims, but all claims. And if you look at whistleblowing claims specifically, in 2013, so to be entered into the Employment Tribunal Judgment Register in 2013, you'd have to have filed your case in 2012 before fees were in place. There were 735 whistleblowing claims. But if you compare that to 2015, which would demonstrate the impact of fees, then that's fallen down to just 421. So there's quite a stark drop in claims, but they are picking back up now since the Unison claim in July 2017, and in 2018 there were 862 claims. So it definitely did have an impact in terms of reducing claims, but we're starting to see an increase now to levels higher than before claims were introduced. And in terms of the judge's gender, there is no study that looks at that to our knowledge, but that certainly could be a very interesting avenue for future research. And that is data that we do have on the judgments. So that's certainly something that we could look into. Thank you.
And that's really interesting. And I know the author Tom Muller, for example, has talked about judge influence in these kinds of decisions, but not relating to gender, more to do with class, professional, hierarchical positions and social networks, which, you know, isn't interesting, the study cited there. And just to put your research into context, I mean, the UK is one of the countries with the oldest whistleblowing law, with the PETA law from the 1990s. So this collection of data on what judgments have been made since that has come in, and for anyone worldwide who's interested in the topic, you know, speaks to this. Sorry, Megan, did you want to?
No, go ahead. If you've got another one you want to point out.
Yeah, there's a really interesting question on, and I think it speaks to, you know, one of the things that we're seeing across the different presentations is that gender seems to be caught up in other sorts of exclusion and stigmatization in various ways in whistleblowing cases. So the sort of the exclusion of the speaker or the disclosure it gets intersected, if you like, to use that word. And one of the questions is, if gender is a hidden aspect of speaking up, is it fair to say that intersectionality as an issue has been totally buried? Do we need, in brackets, do we need to look more at gender and ethnicity, gender and national contexts, and so on? And I mean, certainly since the outbreak of the virus last year, we've seen ethnicity, class, various aspects coming to bear on how and why people speak up. Does anyone want to take that question on intersectionality?
I could jump in quickly there. So in part of the project, we looked at the intersection of whistleblowing claims in combination with different types of discrimination claims, and which were the most commonly claimed types of discrimination. And the top three were race, sex discrimination and disability discrimination. So there is certainly suggestion of some kind of intersectional experience there that's bringing people to employment tribunal. But moving further to determine a claimant's ethnicity from the data sample we had would be quite difficult. There is a project that looks at people's surnames and determines ethnicity based on surnames, but that's not an approach that we felt would be appropriate for this project. But it's certainly something that the data that we have so far is hinting that this is an issue, but we would need further data sets to explore it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. So I know we're on the hour, but since there's so many people still hanging on, I think if we have maybe one or two more questions that we can get to. So there were a couple about the environment or the context that this stuff is happening in. So does the context matter? Do men speaking up in male environments or traditionally male environments where maybe women would feel more empowered to speak up in traditionally female powered environments? And does this speaking up gendered aspect perhaps differ by sector? Does anyone want to speak to that? Like, does the context seem to matter? Laura, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I don't want to kind of dominate, so I thought I'd see if anyone else wanted to say anything. So what we can see is that the public sector is overrepresented in employment tribunal cases for whistleblowing, and certainly that's something that we're seeing wider. If you look at the proportion of claims in the public sector compared to the proportion of the population that's employed there, then there's certainly an overrepresentation of the public sector.
Thanks, Laura. I have a question I think that Daniela and Nana might be best placed to answer. So the questioner asks, I attended a presentation some years ago by 3 women who discussed their work supporting whistleblowers with the WikiLeaks network. Some journalists in the audience attempted to undermine their presentation by suggestion that they were simply working for Putin. What, in your opinion, are the similarities and differences in the ways that the work of female and male whistleblowers and their supporters are undermined?
Thank you for that question. So I could see that the person attended the presentation that eventually turned into the book that we referred to on the first slide, the Women Whistleblowing WikiLeaks. And I think both there, but also in our research where we look, for instance, at the coverage of both Chelsea Manning, but especially also Reality Winner, it was clear to see the sexualization of women whistleblower, but also, as Sarah Harris notes, so there is domestication and inferiority of women whistleblowers as assistants who helped out. So I think Sarah Harrison offers a really nice description of how she was instrumental in getting Snowden out of Hong Kong, but that she was consistently referred to as an assistant instead of a fundamental whistleblower in her own right. So I think that this making women whistleblowers into assistants or sexualized, even infantilized objects. So Reality Winner, I think one of the first articles covering Reality Winner mentioned her Pikachu bedspreads, and so this also making them into sort of children that can't keep a secret in a sense. So so certainly that was a pattern that we were seeing.
Thanks very much. And that kind of leads into another second question that I think Mahal might be well placed to look at. Obviously, I think another aspect of that book, Women WikiLeaks, points to the spaces for resistance and subversion that discrimination also afforded to some of those women. In other words, that by being completely undermined and underestimated, left them with some room for maneuver from a political point of view. And I think one of the questioners, Mao, talks about similar sorts of alternative spaces that these things open up, these experiences of stigmatization. Thank you, Mao, for these theoretical inferences. I have a question about the joy dimension. Is this humor as a coping mechanism? Is it irony?
Yeah, so thank you, Wim, for this question. Nice to see you here. So yeah, we definitely noticed joy, and it could be irony or a coping mechanism, but we were kind of we were like, it was more than that. It referred to a deep feeling in terms of a deep sense of serenity and a feeling of being at the right place, and also a feeling of coherence that this woman would express that they did the right thing to do. And so it was definitely deeper than just humor or making fun of the situation or coping mechanism, in my opinion, if that makes sense. Kate, you may want to add something like this on this joy dimension.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's people sort of writing on this at the moment from various perspectives, but one of the things that I find, so I think Mariana Fataki and Nancy Harding have been talking about the idea of the kind of the subject position that simply doesn't belong within a discursive setting. Sometimes the woman finds herself in this setting, but that there's a kind of a subversion that can go alongside that unheimlich or not belonging perspective, to be placed in the position of sort of the hysteric, as from a Lacanian point of view, or that thing that does not belong, offers a certain kind of freedom, but one would not want to simply celebrate that because it's a qualified kind. But the spaces for action under that kind of discomfort can be productive in some cases, I guess. And I think for me, I mean, I think Megan, we're sort of going to have to close up shop, I'm afraid, given that we're running well past our time. But I think that one of the things that I've found so interesting throughout the presentations are the different ways in which these various spaces have been articulated by our presenters, each in different ways, alongside the implications, the negative experiences that gender can have on speaking out, but also these things can happen in very interesting different ways. There's lots of questions that we haven't gotten to answer, but what we're going to try and do is respond to people after the session. So apologies if we didn't get to your question, we'll do our best to do that. And I just want to say thanks very much to the Whitaker from myself and to everybody who attended, and to all our excellent speakers. Really fantastic. We've had requests for presentations. We've had requests for your talk for Baton coming in already, so we'll pass them on to you. And to everyone who's attended, happy Women's Day for Monday. Megan, do you want to?
No, just thank you again to our speakers. Thank you very much to the Whitaker Institute, and again to the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Project Fund at NUI Galway, and to all of our attendees for joining us today. So great to have such a wonderful, fascinating conversation around what I think is just one of the most interesting topics. So thanks very much.